Hey everyone, welcome back to Mr. Mescher's Lessons. In today's video, I'm going to be going over Chapter 5 of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. If you haven't watched the previous videos, I'd suggest that you go check those out, but this video will be an overview, a summary, and a bit of an analysis of the 5th chapter, the 5th section. They're not actually, if you notice, they're not actually labeled by chapters, but this will be of the 5th section of the book. So up to this point, we haven't seen a lot of action, but chapter 5 is where it gets very action-packed. So chapter 5 starts out, Lenny is in the barn alone. He killed his pup. So Lenny fears George's anger, and he buries it in the hay. And then decides to tell George he found it dead, but he thinks George will know because he always knows. Really? It's not too hard to believe that George is going to know that the puppy just didn't die. So Lenny throws the dead pup, but then he thinks George might not care since he didn't care about the pup at all anyway. Lenny is starting to catch on to the fact that maybe George's level of importance, the puppy isn't actually all that high up there. That's obvious to us as the reader, but that's not obvious to Lenny. So Curly's wife comes in, and Lenny says he isn't supposed to talk to her. She says the horseshoe tournament will distract the men outside, and that it'll be okay, and that they can hang out together. No big deal. So this is where we hear the story of where her mother wouldn't let her be a model, and years later she was tricked again. So she married Curly, who she dislikes. It would really stink to be married to someone you didn't like. It always is saddening for me to think about experiences like that. But she's married to Curly. They don't get along, but it's just how it is. Lenny tells her about the bunnies, which he already lightly spoke of in section 4. He likes them because they are soft, so she lets her feel his hair, but he's kind of rough from being so excited. So she tells him to stop, and when he doesn't, because he's now afraid of her screaming, because he's worried about getting in trouble, she screams out. Then Lenny gets really freaked out. He covers her mouth, and then he shakes her to keep her quiet. Lenny's a pretty big guy. Grabbing a woman and shaking her, a rather small woman, when he's so large, it's probably not going to turn out well. He breaks her neck. Compared to all the other actions in the story, this one was like, oh my gosh, really? Wow. Okay, so Lenny covers her in the hay, and he grabs his pup and hides. George hopes that the men of the farm are lenient, but Candy says they're not going to be. George says he knows their plan would never work. And so his plan with Candy is to pretend to be surprised about Curly's wife should the topic come up. Then Candy curses Curly's wife for destroying their dream on the farm. Carlson says his gun is missing, and he thinks Lenny took it, so Curly and Crooks grab their guns and set out to get Lenny. So, chapter ends with them running out to find Lenny and take him out. They think he's a pretty big threat. Okay, so in chapter 5, starting on page 84. Looking at page 85, let's look at the conversation that Lenny has with the puppy. I mean, he has it literally with the puppy. Now, maybe George ain't gonna let me tend no rabbits. If he finds out you got killed. He scooped a little hollow and laid the puppy in it and covered it over with hay out of sight, but he continued to stare at the mound he had made. He said, "This ain't no bad thing like I gotta go hide in the brush. Oh, no, it ain't. I'll tell George I found it dead." So here we see Lenny's decision-making skills aren't the greatest. He does eventually pick up on the fact that, well, George is probably not going to believe the fact that the puppy just died. But his initial thought is, oh, I'll just cover it up in hay and act surprised when I see it too. In truth, had that situation occurred, I'm sure Lenny would have been upset and emotional, and George would have seen right through it very quickly. Lenny doesn't realize that, though. He thinks that George just has some way of figuring everything out. Then he gets mad at the puppy. He gets mad because he says, "Why do you got to get killed? You ain't so little as mice." He picked up the pup and hurled it from him. He turned his back on it. He sat and bent his knees and he whispered, "Now I won't get to tend the rabbits. Now he won't let me." I gotta feel kind of bad for Lenny. Lenny's main focus in life is that he wants to tend some rabbits. He's been told that is his American dream. But he's probably not going to ever get to do it. I mean, even if this situation would have resolved itself or even ever occurred, would George have always had Lenny's best intentions in mind? How about when he goes to the whorehouse? Would he have had Lenny's best intentions in mind at that point? Probably not. Okay, on to page 86. We see when Curly's wife walks in. Says her face was made up and the little sausage curls were all in place. She was quite near to him before Lenny looked up and saw her. She's a very physical person. She's close. Never in the novel does she attempt to be sexual with the men, but she uses her sexuality to her advantage. You know, she leans forward and shows off her looks in the barn with the men. She's never detailed as having sex with them. They all, if you guys have ever seen the Office scene where everybody's got their guns cocked and loaded and pointed at each other, that's how they act, despite the fact that Curly's wife has never cheated on him, and despite the fact that these men don't even have any particular interest in Curly's wife. She ends up being a threat between them because, well, if they were to end up having sex with Curly's wife, they'd be in a lot of trouble, and Curly would be mad, and they would fight. So she ends up being an issue for them, rather than just being a person. She ends up being a tool of malice and scaredness at times, worrisome. Just an issue for them. I mean, rather than looking at her as a person who maybe wants friendship or is using her physicality in order to try to get ahead, they just want her to stop. They'd rather use the whorehouse than even have a conversation with her. So, she knows. On 86, we know that she knows that Lenny broke Curly's hand. She says, "He's scared Curly'll get mad." Well, Curly got his arm in a sling, and if Curly gets tough, you can break his other hand. She knows. She's okay with it. She obviously doesn't care about Curly all that much. A little later, she says, "Why can't I talk to you? I never get to talk to nobody. I get awful lonely." I feel bad. This is the part where I feel the most bad for her. It's unfortunate. Curly's wife is in an unfortunate scenario where she's not happy with the person she's married with, and she just wants some kind of conversation. She's sitting completely alone in a barn with Lenny. If she really wanted the sex from someone, I'm sure she could easily get it. She often sneaks off from Curly, but it's because she wants conversation. She wants a friend. She doesn't treat people very nicely. She certainly doesn't treat crooks very nicely. She doesn't treat Candy very nicely, or Lenny, but she wants friends. Feel kind of bad for her. On page 87, she's kind of similar to Crooks. She says, "I get lonely. You can talk to people, but I can't talk to nobody but Curly, else he gets mad. How do you like to have nobody to talk to?" A little later, they start talking about the puppy, and she says to him, "Don't you worry none, he was just a mutt. You can get another one easy, the whole country is full of mutts." What is she referring to here? Is she talking about dogs? Could be. I think it has a bit of a double meaning, though. I would say it does. The country is full of mutts. I think she's talking about a lot of the guys in the country. All of the guys. She's saying the stereotypical men aren't shit. And, I'm probably rightfully so. She's frustrated with men, but she didn't exactly look for a great one either. It's not very fair of her to say that, considering the fact that she just picked Curly. He certainly didn't take long to find him. She gave up on her dream and settled for him rather than waiting for a good guy. So she's not the greatest character in the book. She's just very sad. Don't I have a right to talk to anybody? Boo hoo hoo. I feel bad for her in some spots, but in other spots I don't pity her. She treats people like crap and then wonders why she can't have friends. Tough, I suppose. So then she, on 88, 89, she's a dreamer too, but she doesn't realize the men who said she can't be in pictures with were giving her the runaround. They maybe were trying to get hooked up with each other. They were trying to just give her an honest compliment. She doesn't pick up on that. She says, well, I ain't told this to nobody before. Maybe I oughtn't to. I don't like Curly. He ain't a nice fella. And because she had confided in him, she moved closer to Lenny and sat beside him. Notice how the author specifically points out why she moves closer to Lenny. Could have been in the movies and had nice clothes. All them nice clothes like they wear. And I could have sat in the big hotels and had pictures took of me. When they had them interviews, I could have went to him and spoke in the radio, and it wouldn't have cost me a cent because I was in the picture. And in all the nice clothes like they wear. Because this guy says I was a natural. She was definitely given the runaround by these guys. I don't think they were genuinely interested in her as a scouting measure. Or they would have probably followed through. They probably fed her a lie in order to take advantage of her or to make her feel good temporarily or to just kind of make her feel like she's worth something. So Lenny on page 90 says, oh, I like to pet nice things, and she lets him feel her hair, and he says, don't muss it. She says muss it. She just, don't mess it up. You can feel it, just don't mess it up. And he's so excited. He likes to feel soft, beautiful things, so he's feeling her hair, and he gets a little too excited, and gets rough with her, and she gets frustrated. And she starts to say, you let go. And it says Lenny was in a panic. His face was contorted. She screamed then, and Lenny's other hand closed over her mouth and nose. Please don't, he begged. Oh, please don't do that. George will be mad. Well, there's probably not a lot of logic going on between either of these characters. If Lenny was thinking through the scenario, he would not, kill her. He's very strong. He probably has the ability to either physically harm her, very much so, or kill her. Unfortunately, he can restrain her, but he doesn't have a lot of control or understanding of how strong he is. So, of course, he's going to go overboard. But all she has to do is stop screaming. So, from her perspective, if she were to just stop screaming, I'm sure Lenny would calm down and the situation would resolve, but she continues to scream, and she continued to struggle, and her eyes were wild with terror. He shook her then, and he was angry with her. Don't you go yelling, he said, and he shook her, and her body flopped like a fish, and then she was still, and for Lenny had broken her neck. It stinks to read. As soon as Lenny realizes what he's done, he says, I done a bad thing. I done another bad thing. Lenny isn't quite capable of realizing what a bad thing on a scale is. So he thought he had done a bad thing when he had the mouse in his pocket. He thought he had done a bad thing by messing around with Curly. He thought he had done a bad thing by talking to Curly's wife. And he had thought he had done a bad thing when he had killed his pup. But to break another person's neck is not only an irreversible action, it carries quite the consequence. Killing a puppy, probably sweep that under the rug. Breaking Curly's wife's neck, there's going to be some kind of consequence for that, even if it was a complete accident, even if, there's going to be some kind of consequence for that. He is not able to pick up on that, though. So he just thinks he does another bad thing. So he decides this is the bad. And to some degree, he does pick up on that because he thinks, okay, now I got to go hide in the ditch because this is bad. I got to go hide in the bushes so George can come here. He'll know I'm here because I remembered and I'm great. So he goes there. Yeah, he covers her body in hay, runs away. It says Curly's wife lay with a half covering of yellow hay, and the meanness and the plannings and the discontent and the ache for attention were all gone from her face. She was very pretty and simple, and her face was sweet and young. Now her rouged cheeks and her reddened lips made her seem alive and sleeping very lightly. The curls, tiny little sausages, were spread on the hay behind her head, and her lips were parted. She's not living. There's not a recovery for this. So she's probably going to die. The men come in and notice, and they said, George said, I should have knew, George said helplessly. I guess maybe way back in my head I did. Then he says to himself, maybe they'll lock him up and be nice to him. Yeah, I doubt that. He's worked with these rancher guys long enough. I think he's reassuring himself more than trying to be realistic here. It says, but Candy said, this is on 94, but Candy said excitedly, we ought to let him get away. You don't know that, Curly. Curly gonna want to get him lynched. Curly will get him killed. Candy says a little later, you and me can get that little place, can't we, George? You and me can go there and live nice, can't we, George? Can't we? George said softly, I think I knowed that from the very first. I think I knowed we'd never do her. He used to like to hear about it so much, I got to thinking maybe we would. Now George has given up on his dream of living on this farm too. Then on the bottom of 95, Curly says, Candy says, old Candy watched him go. He looked helplessly back at Curly's wife, and gradually his sorrow and his anger grew into words. You goddamn tramp, he said viciously. You done it, didn't you? I suppose you're glad. Everybody knowed you messed things up. You wasn't no good. You ain't no good now, you lousy tart. He sniveled and his voice shook. I could have hoed in the garden and washed dishes for them guys. Is it really? Is any of this really anyone in particular's fault? Is this Lenny's fault? Well, it's his fault that her neck is broke. But is this her fault? Is this Curly's wife's fault? No, not really. But someone has to be blamed. And because the characters don't consider the fact that Lenny doesn't have the most rational decision-making skills, in that he doesn't realize what he's done, Candy decides he's going to blame Curly's wife. All the other characters decide they're going to blame Lenny. And then on Curly said, at the bottom of 96, Curly says, I know who done it, he cried. That big son of a bitch done it. I know he done it. Why, everybody was out there playing in horseshoes. He worked himself into a fury. I'm going to get him. I'm going to get my shotgun. I'll kill the big son of a bitch myself. I'll shoot him in the guts. Come on, you guys. He ran furiously out of the barn. Carlson said, I'll get my Luger, and he ran out too. Slim turned quietly to George. I guess Lenny done it all right, he said. Her next bust. Lenny could have did that. So Slim sighed, well, I guess we'll go get him. Where you think he might have went? So they have a little more conversation. And Carlson comes back and said, the bastard stole my Luger. It ain't in my bag. Curly followed him, and Curly carried a shotgun in his good hand. Curly was cold now. Well, they're out for blood at this point, for sure. Said, all right, you guys, he said. The N-word's got a shotgun. You take it, Carlson. When you see him, don't give him no chance. Shoot for his guts. That'll double him over. Whit said excitedly, I ain't got a gun. Curly said, you go and sold that and get a cop. Get Al Whit. He's deputy sheriff. Let's go now. Why are they so excited about killing Lenny, really? I'm sure most of the characters at this point have picked up on the fact that Lenny has some kind of mental disability. Why are they so excited to kill him? Curly said, he gets madder and madder, and he says, I'm going to shoot the guts out of that big bastard myself. Even if I only got one hand, I'm going to get him. Wow. Just to be so excited about literally murdering someone seems very inhumane. So that's all of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 is also very short, so stay tuned for that one, and I will see you in the next video.